Steph, Caregivers Chronicles Unveiled, the critical care unit for caregivers. Real conversations, real care, real healing. Doc Steph, I see your hands holding the weight of 100 plans. Soft in the dark, strong in the light. You make it feel a little more right. Take a breath.
Hey, compassion fatigue rarely arrives with an announcement. More often, it enters quietly, one small change at a time. One of the challenges caregivers face is that we become very skilled at noticing changes in the people we care for. We notice when their mood change, when their appetite changes, when their energy decreases, or when something simply seems off. We pay attention because their well being matters to us. What we do not always do is apply that same level of attention to ourselves. As caregivers, we often explain away our own struggles. We tell ourselves we are just tired. We blame stress, busy schedules, difficult seasons, or getting older. While those factors may play a role, they can also prevent us from recognizing when something deeper is happening. Compassion fatigue often develops gradually, which is why so many caregivers miss the warning signs until they begin affecting multiple areas of life. So, welcome to Caregivers Chronicles Unveiled. I am your host, Doc Staff, and in our previous episode, Compassion Runs Dry, we discussed what compassion fatigue is and why it develops. We explored how the ongoing emotional investment of caring for another person can gradually deplete um, our emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual reserves. So today, I want us to take the next step in that conversation. If compassion fatigue develops over time, how do we recognize it? How do we know when caregiving is affecting us more than we realize? These are important questions because awareness is often the first step toward healing. We cannot address what we refuse to acknowledge, and we cannot care for ourselves if we do not recognize the signs that something within us needs attention. One of the reasons compassion fatigue is so difficult to identify is that it does not affect everyone in the same way. Some caregivers notice changes physically, others experience emotional shifts. For some, the signs appear mentally, relationally, or spiritually. Regardless of how it appears, compassion fatigue can affect the whole person. For many of us, the first sign appears physically. Okay, at first, it seemed like ordinary exhaustion. After all, caregiving can be demanding. There are appointments to attend, medications to manage, schedules to coordinate, and responsibilities that often extend well beyond a normal day. Even for professional caregivers, in the professions, um, is managing all of their patients, managing all of their clients. That can be a little overwhelming. Yet there's a difference between being tired and feeling exhausted in a way that never seems to improve. Some caregivers begin noticing that sleep no longer feels restorative. They may get several hours of sleep, yet wake up feeling just as tired as when they went to bed. Others experience headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues, or a constant sense of fatigue throughout the day. The body often communicates what the mind has not yet fully acknowledged. And then compassion fatigue can also appear emotionally. Many of us describe feeling more irritable than usual, Situations that once required patience suddenly feel difficult to manage. Small frustrations can seem larger than they once did, like emotional reserves that previously allowed us to respond with understanding and flexibility are beginning to run low. Some caregivers experience something even more confusing. They notice themselves becoming emotionally numb. They still care deeply about the person they are supporting, yet they feel less emotionally connected than before. It can create feelings of guilt because many caregivers mistakenly assume that emotional numbness means they no longer care. And for example, one time, the doctor ran my primary care doctor ran some tests, and instead of her calling me directly, she had um, someone else call, and they just laid it out there, and I'm like, what? So I'm mind blown. And so I scheduled an appointment, and I'm telling her, why didn't you tell me something? I mean, you just dropped this bomb on me, and left it like that. And her response was, oh well, half of America has this, or whatever, and I see so many of it. To me, that's numbness. That's numbness to me as her patient. My feelings, how I would take the news, because she's dealt with this multiple times. She felt as though everyone else would respond the same way that she felt about it. It's nonchalant. It's nothing. But in reality, emotional numbness is often a sign of emotional overload. The mind sometimes creates distance to protect itself from continuous emotional strain. So, therefore, compassion fatigue can also affect us mentally. Caregiving requires constant decision making. We often think several steps ahead, anticipating potential problems and preparing for unexpected situations. Over time, this ongoing mental effort can be exhausting, to the point where, hopefully, I explained that I have caregived for my mom for 15 years, and dealing with my own health issues. It was keeping all of the appointments together. Sometimes I would be at taking her to an appointment, and actually it was I who had appointments, so we were in the wrong places. It's just that the overload, the exhaustion. So some caregivers begin to experience difficulty concentrating. Others find themselves forgetting things more frequently or struggling to make decisions that once seemed simple. The issue is not a lack of intelligence or capability, it is the result of a mind that has been carrying significant responsibilities for an extended period of time. The relational impact of compassion fatigue is another area that deserves attention. Many caregivers discover that their world gradually become smaller. Activities they once enjoyed begin disappearing from their schedules. Phone calls go unanswered. Invitations are declined. Friendships become more difficult to maintain. This withdrawal is not always intentional. Often we simply lack the energy. And also, for example, as for me, you know, um, I didn't know how to carry a conversation because all I did was care. I was caregiving 24/7. And so being around friends, I didn't know what to talk about, how to participate in conversations. Only thing that I could talk about was caregiving. And, people got or probably were tired of hearing it. So the invitations became less. I withdrew less. Even with that, hanging out with friends or whatever. The whole time I'm with them, I'm thinking about the person that I'm caring for. And, if something happened, is she okay? Things like that. So after spending so much of ourselves meeting the needs of others, there may be little left for social engagement or meaningful connections. Over time, isolation can deepen, making compassion fatigue even harder to recognize and address. Perhaps the least discussed area is the spiritual impact. Whew. We have questions we rarely share with anyone else, because we're thinking in our mind, um, why am I feeling so exhausted? Why do I feel guilty when I need rest? Why am I struggling with this? Why does prayer sometimes feel difficult? Why I feel distant from God? These questions do not necessarily reflect a lack of faith. In many cases, it reflects on the reality of burdens endured for an extended period without adequate restoration. Compassion fatigue affects the whole person because caregiving requires the whole person. One of the realities I discovered during my caregiver journey is that compassion fatigue does not always reveal itself through dramatic moments of breakdown. More often, it develops beneath the surface while we continue doing what caregivers do best, showing up and handling responsibilities. The challenge is that caregiving often conditions us to focus our attention outward. We become accustomed to monitoring others' needs, responding to crises, managing appointments, solving problems, and adapting to changing circumstances. That outward focus can make it difficult to recognize what is happening within us. Looking back, I can see that there were periods when I was caring far more emotionally than I realized. I was so committed to meeting the needs around me that I rarely stopped along or long enough to evaluate the impact caregiving was having on my own well-being. Because I was still functioning, I assumed I was managing. Because I was still showing up, I assumed I was okay. What I eventually learned is that caregiving, um, that continuing to function is not always evidence of thriving. Sometimes it means we have become skilled at carrying heavy burdens while ignoring the toll they take on us. So, one of the passages that often comes to mind when I think about caregiving in Psalms 23. Most of us are familiar with the imagery of green pastures and still waters. Yet, I wonder how often we pause long enough to consider what those images actually represent. The psalmist, David, is describing restoration. The interesting thing about restoration is that it assumes depletion has occurred. Something cannot be restored unless something has first been poured out, expended, or diminished. As caregivers, we spend so much time focusing on the needs of others that we sometimes forget that we are also human beings with limits, emotions, and needs of our own. Many caregivers struggle with the idea of rest because they view it as something that must be earned. We tell ourselves we will slow down when things settle down, when the crisis passes, or when fewer responsibilities demand our attention. The challenge is that caregiving rarely follows our preferred timeline. There's always another task, another concern, or another need waiting for attention. What I appreciate about Psalms 23 is that God does not simply acknowledge our need for restoration, He actively leads us toward it. The same God who calls us to love, serve, and care for others also understands that we cannot continually pour out without being replenished ourselves. Restoration is not evidence that we care less. In many ways, it is what allows us to continue caring well. So thank you for joining me for this episode of Caregiver Chronicles Unveiled. I am Doc Steph, and I hope today's conversation helps you recognize that the signs of compassion fatigue are not something to fear. They are signals telling us to pay attention to ourselves with the same amount of compassion we so often extend to others. I also invite you to join the conversation. If today's discussion resonate with you, consider sharing your experience, insights, or reflections. One of the most powerful things caregivers can do is remind one another that none of us is walking this journey alone. Your story may be the encouragement or understanding that another caregiver needs to hear. Join me next time as we continue our conversation in episode 8, Disconnected, where we will explore what happens when compassion fatigue begins affecting our connection to ourselves, others, and the life we once knew. Peace and blessings.
Dark stuff. Real conversations, real care, real healing.